Greetings, friends. This is a very brief video to help introduce the concept of grounded theory. By now, you will have proceeded well into your research process. You will have identified a research problem, reviewed the literature, come up with a research question, and specified a purpose. Grounded theory is about collecting data and analyzing and interpreting that data and reporting that data. So this is the part of the research process that grounded theory can help us complete. Grounded theory is a particular kind of qualitative analysis. There's several different types, and our text talks about those. In the same way, there are several different types of quantitative analysis. Quantitative analysis has to do with t-tests and ANOVAs and correlations and regressions, among other statistical analysis that you can run. Grounded theory is one kind um, of qualitative research. You can do a phenomenological report, you can do research, you can do an ethnographic, you can do a narrative. This is one particular kind of qualitative research. And what you're looking for in in grounded theory is a way to generate a theory that explains a phenomena. So what you're going to try to come up with in this process is a way to explain why people act the way they do, why they think the way they do, why they have the perceptions that they have. Grounded theory was begun by two authors who were studying nurses, I believe it was, and couldn't come up with a methodology that really did capture what it is that they were trying to find out about particular practices of nurses. And so they came up with what eventually became known as grounded theory. They were colleagues until the very end, although they did have differences of opinion about how grounded theory should be conducted. One was more formal and wanted to stick to procedures. The other was more free formal. And you'll feel that tension when you see people talk about how grounded theory should be conducted. How do you do grounded theory? Well, one thing that would help you is this little chart that shows the different steps in the research process, the grounded theory research process. And if you can imagine that activity is flowing through two circles that are side by side to each other. So on one side we have data collection. That's where you go and conduct your interviews, and from that you prepare transcripts, and you initially read through the transcripts, and you engage in something called coding, which we will talk about a little further. You code these texts, and then you go back and you will keep interviewing people and preparing the data and reading through and code, and you keep doing this until you get a sense that you have all the data that you need to be able to conduct your research. But at the same time, you're starting to generate themes. And so you're going through this process as well as going through this process on this side. So as you're doing the interviews, you're also asking yourself the question, what does all this research mean? What are the common kinds of expressions and perceptions that I'm running into when I interview people? So we call this an iterative process, which means it keeps going and going and going. And what you're doing is interviewing and coding, and on this side you're actually developing themes that help to explain the different interviews that you've conducted. Another way of looking at it, this is the same process, only conceptualized a little bit differently. You're going to generate the texts, and then you're going to divide, we call it chunking, divide into segments. You're going to code those segments, and that means to identify what each of those little segments mean, or some way of describing what it is that people are getting at to by talking the way they do. You're going to reduce the initial coding to fewer codes until you come up with a certain number of themes that help describe what it is that you're finding, you're discovering about these people that you're interviewing, or situations that you're observing, or documents that you're reading. This is where you want to end up. You want to end up with these, our text says 5 to 7, some people say 3 to 5 themes. That's when you read, you give the reader your best sense of what's going on in a particular situation that you're observing. We want to talk about this process, this coding process. And what you do when you're coding is you are taking the transcript that you've generated and you're dividing it into segments. Some people call it you're chunking the data. And then you're starting to identify what each of those chunks represent. Now, here's an example from our text that we used last year where they chunked this one part of the paragraph here. And they said this represents one singular kind of idea, and this represents one singular kind of idea as well, as does this. And then they took from those chunks a term that would help to identify, and we'll call that a code. So you give that segment a code. And like we said, in our diagram, you're going to come up with 30 to 40 codes possibly to represent all the different segments that you're discovering. So you divide those segments into code, those segments, divide the text into segments, and then you code each of those segments. And then what you're trying to do is to move from a lot of different and distinct codes and identify codes that sound very much like each other. Maybe they say the same thing but in different ways, or maybe they are subsets of each other. And you create those into codes, those codes into themes. Now, the data that you use for this, or the term that's used to code data, there are three actually ways that you can identify a term that goes along with a particular chunk of text. One is to take the imagery that evokes. If somebody is, talking about situations that make them frightened, you can use fear or joy or elation or apprehension. That might be one segment that you look at. Another one is called in vivo code, where you actually use the word that people use. And closed-knit community here becomes an in vivo kind of code. Health of community. Those are in vivo kinds of codes. And so what you will do from that, we'll give you an example of all that here in just a moment, is once you've constructed those codes, you start collapsing them and hopefully end up with 3 to 5 themes that explain all of it. So let me give you an example of what we're going to be doing from our assignment here. This is the Why I Want to Be a Teacher assignment. And what I did was I began the process of segmenting or chunking the data. And then I gave it a code out here on the side. In this one particular essay, they were inspired by a role model. So, even though that's not the words that they use, I used that as the code for that segment. Teaching would allow them to engage in their passions. That's a chunk. That's a code that describes a chunk of the data, a segment of the interview. Opportunities for personal involvement. That was a segment of this particular essay. They like the idea of being challenged by situations, and also this one person said that they felt that they had the characteristics that would make for a good teacher. So that's part of what they that's part of the essay. Second page, found it personally rewarding. They felt that it was meaningful work. This work would be personally satisfying. Again, those are codes. They're achievement oriented, and they can see their future self. So this is just examples of what I found in this. Somebody else would find something different, maybe more, maybe less. What you do with that then is you list all the codes here. That's what I did. And you start to group them together. Now you might have, with 6 essays, you might have 30 or 40 codes. And this process might take a little while. Some people like doing this with sticky notes and moving them around. That certainly would be one way of doing all this. So here we see, this one theme of being personally rewarding. Now, sometimes you can take one of the codes, and that actually becomes a label for the theme. Personally satisfying, personally rewarding, that goes into this. Inspired by a role model, they felt qualified, have meaningful work. Now, this is just one essay. There might be a number of them, but you can begin to see that we're developing themes. So this is this part of the process. I went through and coded this, and then I started to develop themes. I would go through and do this again, code more essays, and I might come up with different themes. In fact, you keep going around until you're all done with this, until you feel like you've exhausted it. Okay, then once you've done that, and you've already have read now a number of qualitative research articles, you have an idea about how the findings are to be reported. You write in the findings section that you found 3 themes, 4 themes, 5 themes. Each one of those themes then becomes a heading for that part of the chapter. Then you write on it as you would write any kind of a research report. You would pull from that some of the dialogue that supports your themes as examples. You could use participant language, write very descriptively and powerfully using metaphors and analogies. And you don't have to have everybody say the same thing. In a theme, some people might find something different. But at the end, you want to very carefully and dynamically report what is you found, and we use this term report before about using rich, thick descriptions. And so our activity for this week is to write in one section. I have one paragraph there. I should mean one theme, and use rich, thick description to describe that theme. So you're going to go through all the essays and partition those and chunk those and code those, and you're going to come up with a number of themes, and you're going to describe just one of those. So hopefully you find this helpful, and if you need any additional assistance, feel free to contact me. Thanks.